So I think the stuff around IQ is pretty relevant here. So taking like norms from IQ tests that were developed by white straight, by white Western men on white Western men, and then testing them on other people, including Indigenous people. And there's still actually, shockingly, people today taking IQ tests that were developed in Western countries and that measure what what intelligence is culturally bound, and the idea of intelligence in some cases is a completely cultural artifact. But taking these tests and running them in all different countries and then concluding, like coming up with a list, like a ranking list of who the smartest countries are and who the smartest races are and things like that, which is just, I think, shocking given all that all the progress we've made in psychology so far.
Yeah.
And so, then like with that Queensland test, when they found like deviances, like, Indigenous people were typically like not scoring well on these tests unless they'd had contact with Western European people, they interpreted that not as that, maybe our test is culturally bound, but as like, because we are the norm and we're bringing Indigenous people into the norm, we're teaching them cognitive abilities. And there's so much ethnocentrism in that, in the history of psychology, and hopefully not in its future.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, it's like so common to just not even report if you have any Indigenous folks in the sample as well. So you might run a study which has like a convenient sample for 100 psychology students. And a question, especially 10 years ago or 20 years ago, is if there's any representation of Indigenous students in that. And then there's your test, right, which is just reported as normal. And it's very easy to do that. Very common to do that in my own studies. There's studies which have that, non-reporting, which was certainly normal in the old days. Yeah. And frequently you would report the gender of your sample, and you might have a psychology sample of, 80% women. This is kind of going in the other direction. Then you just would treat that as if it's normal. But actually, that's a real difference, a real distinction. So whether you're looking 40 years ago at samples of undergrads that were almost entirely men, or now, or looking at samples that are primarily, non-Indigenous Australians, and failing to report it or think about it or consider it. These are all biases that really continue today. Yeah, peer review is the bomb, but it is a way of getting like this machine gun of like random ignorant prejudice sometimes. There's many aspects of that we could talk about, like sometimes just because the data's from Australia, people are like, it's like niche, this shouldn't be published in a mainstream journal, it should be American data because that's not niche. But that is even more the case, I think, when you're dealing with questions of Indigenous well-being. Have you encountered that kind of feedback about what's niche and what's publishable?
Not so much. The journals that I go for are more Australian at this point in my career, but also along with my values and the dissemination of, the target audience. So at this point, I've not got too much feedback from international aspects like that. And I am not keen to try after that comment.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's publishing in Australian journals, that's like, it's good because that work is relevant here. And it's to some extent treated with more respect here. But that's just an example of that kind of racism that we're talking about, where it's like if you study, 100 college kids from Chicago, that goes in the mainstream journal, the top international journal, and it's seen to be relevant around the world. But if you study 100 people in community-owned country in, the Northern Territory, that goes into the local journal, and that's only relevant to the local people. And that judgment is actually, not very sciencey. That's quite political and racist. So, yeah.